everyone. Thank you for hanging with us through some technical difficulties we had. I'm Dani Milton, writer and director of The First Martian. The First Martian is a sci-fi film which tells the story of a secretly pregnant older Black scientist in a future Mars colony that's early stage, but pregnancy is not allowed there. It raises questions about choice and bodily autonomy within the high-stakes, dangerous environment of Mars. So joining me today is the science advisor for our film, Dr. Tanya Harrison. So Tanya has worked as a scientist and a mission operations specialist on multiple NASA missions to Mars, including the Opportunity, Curiosity, and Perseverance rovers, and the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. So bridging the worlds of Mars and Earth, as well as academia and industry, she has worked as the Director of Science for Impact at Planet Labs and the Director of Research for Arizona State University's New Space Initiative. Hello, Tanya.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone, Tanya and I will chat for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A just submitted through the YouTube comments. Okay, so Tanya, just let's start first with what are ideal locations for humans to live on Mars? We don't define that in our film, but what are some of the best places on Mars where humans could eventually live?
So it kind of depends on what resources you want to be close to. A lot of the places we've focused on for human landing sites tend to be kind of in the northern mid-latitudes where we know there's a lot of buried ice. We had a lander back in the early or mid 2000s called Phoenix that landed in the northern high latitudes and dug some tiny little trenches and exposed ice there. And with Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, we actually saw impact craters form. Like we had a picture where there was no crater, and then a picture from weeks, months, or even years later where there was a new crater where these craters had excavated buried ice. And so we know that there's this layer of ice that crosses huge swaths of that part of the planet. So you could mine that ice for drinking water for astronauts. You could use it to make rocket fuel to get them back from Mars if you want them to come home at some point. But the trade-off there is the weather is not great in that entire latitude band. There's really bad storms for huge swaths of the year. And in the places where there's a lot of ice, they don't tend to be the most geologically interesting spots on the planet in the relative sense. And you're exposed to a lot of radiation on the surface of Mars. So one of the other proposed habitat sites has been these caves called lava tubes, which form underneath the giant volcanoes. And we only know that they're there because we've seen little skylights where basically the top of the cave has collapsed. And so we see the roof into a really dark pit. And we only see them around the volcanoes. So we know, thanks to seeing things like this on Earth, it's probably these lava tubes. And it's places where you had lava flowing underneath the volcanoes. And now that that lava is gone, the volcanoes on Mars haven't erupted in at least 10 to 100 million years. It just leaves these little tubes behind that are perfect caves where we could just basically stick an airlock on either side and build a habitat in there. But then you have to be willing to live underground with no windows. And I don't know how I'd feel about that. I might take the boring, stormy plains over living in a cave without being able to see anything.
Yeah, so how big are the lava tubes on average? Are we talking like hundreds of meters, dozens of meters in terms of width where you could build out like a home or some kind of building or structure?
It's hard to say on Mars because we can only see the spots where there's kind of the hole in the roof, but we usually can't even see the floor. It's just so dark. So we'd really need to send some robots that can go into the caves and scope them out. And there's folks at places like the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Southern California that are trying to make these little cave robots to do just that. We know on Earth, they can be quite huge. Like you could build something maybe like 10 to 20 meters across in some cases. I think there might even be some with the larger volcanoes that are even bigger than that. So everything on Mars tends to be a lot bigger than the equivalent things on Earth. We're not entirely sure why. Some of it might be because of the lower gravity, but some of it is literally just, this is very big and weird. That's science for you. So maybe the lava tubes on Mars are even bigger. So it's a lot less confining feeling to build a habitat in there. fingers crossed.
Got it. So that's a really good point about living in the lava tubes potentially versus living outside exposed kind of on the plains that are stormy. What are plans to for humans to survive Mars's outside habitat? Like there's no oxygen, it's very cold. What are the pros and cons of living in either situation?
So living underground helps protect you from the harsh radiation that Mars gets bathed in all the time. Some of it is what we call cosmic background radiation. So there's just stuff flying around space all the time. But then there's a lot of radiation that comes out of the sun, especially when we have things like solar flares. And on the Earth, we're pretty protected by those thanks to our magnetic field. And we can see that when you see things like the northern lights. That's literally all that the particles that are shooting out of the sun interacting with our magnetic field. On Mars, the magnetic field is almost entirely gone. And so a lot of those particles make it all the way to the surface. And so you don't want that hitting DNA, for example. That can cause a lot of damage. So building habitats underground in these lava tubes or inside the walls of crater walls or canyons, so that it's at least partly protected, but you have some vista to see outside on Mars, have all been proposed for the radiation problem. There's also folks that are working on developing different types of materials to maybe build the habitats out of that might give you a little bit of extra protection, as well as biological methods. Are there pills that you could take to make you more radiation resistant, or different types of fabrics that you could make that might be able to protect people? And obviously that's super useful on Earth as well for any type of high radiation environment. So it's nice to see that we can develop things that have multiple use cases. Maybe it can benefit us here on Earth too.
Oh, that's really wonderful. So talk a little bit about the lack of oxygen on Mars. If we want to eventually make that a more permanent home for humans, it sounds like we might need a longer term solution so we're not having to wear like oxygen, take oxygen tanks out on the surface and so forth. So what are some of the efforts to bring oxygen to Mars?
So conveniently, even though there's only less than 1% of oxygen in the Martian atmosphere right now, the vast majority, like 99% of it, is carbon dioxide. So carbon and two oxygens. And we have technology to rip those molecules apart and harness that oxygen. And we're doing it on the surface of Mars right now with the Perseverance rover. It has a little instrument on the back, I think it's about yay big, called MOXIE, the Mars Oxygen In Situ Experiment. I think that's the whole thing. We have all these acronyms and you use them so often, sometimes you forget what they stand for. But it's pulling in carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere, ripping the carbon and oxygen apart. The carbon gets sequestered and the oxygen gets released back out into the atmosphere. And this was specifically designed to be a scale model of something that we could build a few orders of magnitude larger to have the exact same technology to create breathable oxygen for astronauts in the future. But even then, you're kind of generating that still to be inside a habitat. If we wanted to make it so we could walk safely on the surface of Mars at some point in the future, not having to wear spacesuits or carrying oxygen tanks, we're probably looking hundreds or thousands of years into the future, because we'd have to generate so much oxygen, create so much of an atmosphere, because even the atmosphere that's there right now is only less than 1% as thick as the Earth. So it's about the equivalent of being at 130,000 feet in elevation here on the Earth. So higher than like commercial airplanes can fly even. So it's pretty dicey place right now. So it would take a lot of work and a lot of technology that we don't necessarily have yet to turn it into something that humans could just wander around on.
Got it. So then in terms of the MOXIE that's currently there performing that technology from one of the rovers, how much oxygen output is that creating like on a daily basis, for example?
Oh, I can't remember the exact number. I think it's like the equivalent of a few grams a day or something like that. It's very small because it's not a very large instrument.
Got it. Okay, interesting. But conceivably, if you had a larger device, it could provide self-sustaining oxygen for maybe one person for a certain period of time or so.
Yeah, I'm not sure if anybody's proposing having like individual oxygen generators that you would wear. It's more like building industrial size ones that you could pump into an entire habitat. But I wonder if they work efficiently enough, or if it would be light enough to be able to carry that as your oxygen source. That's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, we'll see. This is so exciting, like just the science of it, and it's just getting closer and closer and closer. The more we learn about Mars and are able to explore there and send rovers. So then Mars is very cold as well. I believe the surface temperature is about 80 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, if that's correct. So in terms of a cold weather situation, what does that look like for daily living with humans there?
It's mostly a problem for electronics. So when we send the rovers, for example, they have things like survival heaters on board. So if it's something like wintertime when it gets really cold, or it needs to deal with the huge temperature swings between daytime and nighttime. Again, since Mars lacks much of an atmosphere, the daytime, it could be relatively warm. If you're at the equator in the middle of summer, it might be, 50, 60 degrees Fahrenheit, like on a really, really nice day. But then the overnight low could be something like -100. So the swings are really huge. And we don't tend to build electronics for day-to-day life, like your iPhone probably wouldn't handle that type of temperature swing very well. So having to create stuff that can handle that type of environment, also handle being exposed to the amount of dust that Mars has all the time, it's actually really tricky to do. So like having humans inside a habitat, we would have all sorts of, heating elements in there so that you can create an environment that's very similar to what you would need on Earth. We do that on the International Space Station right now. So we know how to create a lot of that technology in terms of heaters and coolers and dehumidifiers, air recycling systems, so that you're getting really high efficiency in that regard. But scaling up from building something like the size of a rover to an entire habitat to support dozens or hundreds of humans, there's definitely going to be electrical things to consider when you get into those really low temperatures.
Got it. So let's chat about how living on Mars might look different from here on Earth. So today we have a huge pollution problem, a lot of trash. We have plastics, that are just going to live forever, I think, on Earth. Things that were created, 70 years ago are still just sitting in a landfill somewhere, unfortunately. So I assume we will do things differently on Mars. So what would that look like, a zero waste kind of environment where you truly have to reduce, reuse, recycle? What would that look like on Mars?
So a lot of folks are looking at things like, can we 3D print building materials or textiles out of the Martian dirt, regolith we call there, or out of the dust? So people have been testing that with simulated Mars dust and rocks here on Earth, with some interesting success. I think they're eventually going to test it on the moon as well. We would need to change our approach for a lot of things like packaging of food. We'll have to think a lot about medical supplies. We use a lot of single-use plastics in the medical industry right now, but Mars, as far as we know, doesn't have any oil, so we can't be creating plastics. And right now, the way we live on the space station, we do have things like these air recycling systems and like urine recycling systems to create water, but they still are generating a lot of trash. They pack a lot of stuff into these cargo capsules to get rid of it, off the space station, and they're constantly getting resupplied from the Earth. On Mars, you don't have that option. You can only launch once every 2 years. It takes at least 6 months to get there, and it's very expensive to launch things. So it's not sustainable to keep sending things from the Earth. So we're really going to have to rethink, like, how do we be 100% sustainable? If you want to create long-term societies on Mars where you aren't losing something in your system. If you're generating any waste at all, that means you have something that's consumable that you're going to run out of at some point. So figuring out, how can we do better farming practices in a place where we can't necessarily grow things in the soil? What can we do as plastic alternatives? what can we do so we're not polluting the atmosphere, because we actually need to be harnessing the Martian atmosphere to make something for us to breathe. I think it's really going to change our way of thinking in terms of what we need to do to survive in ways that we need to do to combat climate change here on Earth, and we're not necessarily doing a really great job at it right now.
Yeah. Are there any societies or civilizations here on Earth that have sustainable practices and are maybe close to 100% sustainability that we can look to as a kind of a model for Mars?
I mean, certainly this is where things like indigenous ways of knowing really come in, because these are cultures that have been based on living off the land, really understanding how the planet works, the fine balance between, nature in terms of plant life and weather and animals, and just trying to keep all of that in harmony in a way that is so different from how like Western society tends to view the interaction of animals and humans and plant life and the earth. So really understanding that we as humans are not separate from the ecosystem of the planet, but rather we're a part of it. Really changing that perception is going to be so critical for understanding how we survive in a different ecosystem, in a place where maybe, Mars probably doesn't have life today, but understanding how to make an ecosystem there for us to survive, and what we need, not just us as humans, but what are all the other ancillary things that we need to bring with us to survive in terms of an ecosystem. There's a place called Biosphere 2 in Arizona near Tucson, where they tried to simulate this in a completely closed system, where they had air generators, they had plants, they had a pond, they tried to create an entire ecosystem inside. And it was an absolute disaster. A bunch of stuff did not work. It's worthy of an HBO drama on its own. I think there's a book about it, but if you look up Biosphere 2 and the experiments back in the 90s, it's a story worth reading for sure. But it really emphasizes how hard it is to separate, one piece of the ecosystem and put it somewhere else. It's so much more complicated than we really understand.
And that's a really good segue into the difference in gravity on Mars versus here on Earth. When you talk about what we need for daily living, I think a lot of people don't realize that every day here on Earth, like gravity is doing a lot of work with our bodies, right? Our bones and muscles to be able to move around and function. But Mars has a lot less gravitational forces. So what would the effect be on the human body for people who are on Mars for perhaps the rest of their lives?
Yeah, so we're very much adapted to Earth gravity. And we've seen when we send astronauts into space, like on the space station for weeks or months at a time in a zero gravity environment, they very quickly start to lose bone mass, they lose muscle mass, they lose bone density. Just because you're not working against anything, and your body is designed to fight against the force of gravity for when you're walking, when you're breathing, when you're moving around. On Mars, it's about 38% the amount of gravity that we have on Earth. So it's certainly better than being in zero gravity. You've got something to move against, but you're probably still going to run into the same types of issues that the astronauts in space run into in terms of issues with their bones and muscles. There's also some impacts that we've seen in things like vision, which are not fully understood when people are in zero gravity. Not sure if it's a gravity thing or a radiation exposure thing. And then some other like genetic impacts that they saw. There was an experiment where they had twin astronauts, Scott and Mark Kelly. Scott Kelly went into space for a year. Mark stayed on the ground, and they did a bunch of comparison between their two bodies after Scott had come back from space. And there were a lot of changes, even just in that 1 year. But we don't really have any data like that for living in a gravity environment somewhere between Earth and zero gravity, essentially microgravity, because we've only sent people to the moon for a few days at a time. But we know from those experiences that there will be some kind of impact. And so probably just like on the space station, if you have astronauts on their way to Mars and then on Mars, they're going to need a really specialized regimen of exercise that would be critical to make sure that they don't just start to waste away simply from the lack of gravity. So I think on the space station, the astronauts exercise for at least 2 hours every single day.
Oh,
So
wow.
pretty intense.
That's very intense. And so without that exercise regimen, what would the effects be? Would we eventually lose our ability to like walk, and like would our muscles atrophy? Like what would be the outcome of being in a low or zero gravity environment without doing that exercise and so forth? What would the impact to our bodies be? Just out of curiosity.
I think certainly coming back to a high gravity environment of Earth, it would be difficult or nearly impossible to walk. Even with the astronauts that are doing all this exercise on the space station, if they've been up there for a really long time, you'll see them crack open the Soyuz capsule when they come back, and they sometimes have to be carried out of it because they just can't function in Earth's gravity. And it takes a few days to kind of readjust to that. And a lot of these journeys are still much shorter than what you would do on Mars, because not only do you have the 6 months to get there, you have to spend 2 years on Mars before you can head back on another 6-month journey. We've never had anybody stay in space continuously for really much more than a year. Some folks cumulatively have spent more than a year in space, but they've done it over multiple missions. So we have no idea what like a year of space travel plus 2 years in this lower gravity environment will really do to the human body. So it's certainly going to be an experiment on its own.
Oh, got it. Wow, that's really fascinating. 2 hours of exercise every day, man. That's I don't know. I might come back and feel like I couldn't do the exercise every day, man. Okay, so that's a great segue into what does it look like to get to Mars? Like, what's the preparation? What do you get to bring with you? Food stuff. What are you gonna, start adjusting to in terms of diet? Like, how would we prepare to go to Mars and send people there?
So if we take an approach kind of like the space station, usually folks get to bring a few personal items with them. So we've seen folks like astronaut Chris Hadfield brought up a guitar. I think he had put a lot of videos on YouTube seeing things like Space Oddity. Katie Coleman, another astronaut, she brought a flute. They actually have an astronaut band together with a few other astronauts that brought their instruments to space. Some folks brought stuffed animals, like stuff from their kids. Some people bring books, but you tend to have to conserve the size of the thing that you want to bring, or the weight, because the cost per pound to launch something into space is really expensive. So they probably wouldn't let me bring my rock collection as a geologist. I have to bring something like one of these books instead. In terms of food, I think a lot of people still think about freeze-dried food when you think about space, because you always see like astronaut ice cream and freeze-dried strawberries and stuff in museum gift shops. Thankfully, the space program has gotten a lot better than that. They're not quite eating gourmet food yet. There's still a lot of dehydrated packets that they plug into a rehydration machine, because that way you can pack a lot of food in these little flat, kind of metallic-y Mylar packets. But they'll often tailor it to who's on the crew. So if you have like there was a Japanese astronaut that brought some specific types of curry along, and then one of the Japanese airlines served the same food on like a special flight that they could offer, so the passengers could eat like the astronaut in space, which I thought was pretty cool.
That's very cool.
So yeah, you'll be eating better than old school astronauts. You won't be drinking Tang all the time, which is kind of a myth that Tang wasn't really associated with the space sector. It was kind of invented along with Apollo, but not really a NASA thing. So it's another myth of food in space. But basically, if you can dehydrate it, that's really good. I think the two biggest things that you can't have that I would miss a lot are, you can't bring bread because the crumbs will flake off and fly around in zero gravity. So everybody has to eat, like if you're making a sandwich, you use a tortilla instead because they won't flake apart. I really love bread. So if any company out there can figure out how to make not flaky bread that you could eat in space, would be great. And there's a company that tried to work on making cookies in space so that you could have cookies that would be safe to eat on the space station. I can't remember what the update was for that, but yeah, no crumbs. So anything you can think of that flakes apart really easily, you probably wouldn't be able to bring it with you into space.
And I really like baked goods, like sweets, cookies, pastries, pies, and all full of crumbs. So I don't think that would work out for me. Is there anything else in terms of like the physical preparation on Earth to embark on a journey that's going to be 6 months or more to get to Mars? Anything else that science is looking at in terms of that preparation ahead of time?
Yeah, there's some simulation habitats around the world where they focus on a lot of the psychological aspect of living with a small crew and confined quarters, simulating the time delay of the communication between Earth and Mars, because at some point you'll be far enough away from the Earth that the speed of light is such that we can't overcome the laws of physics. So at some point you can't have any real-time communication with anybody on the Earth. It will all be recordings back and forth. That's not something we're used to in society today, where we can just call or text anybody 24/7. It's been a long time since people have been out of contact from the rest of civilization. So they're doing a lot of studies on that to figure out, will people go insane on the way to Mars? What's the optimum crew size? What are the right personality traits that you might need? I remember somebody saying once, you would never put Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin from the Apollo 11 mission together on a long duration mission because they probably kill each other. Just not the right personality type, but very good for a few-day mission where you just have to accomplish a few specific goals and come back. So yeah, the psychological aspect is probably just as important, if not more important, to understand for this type of mission than the physical side, since we already know, for the most part, like how can we design exercises people can do in space.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's wow. Well, that makes sense though. Like tiny spaces and like it's 6 months or longer. That's a long time for people to be in close quarters together, really with nowhere to go. So what are some of those exercises or things that have been designed to help make that journey more, I wouldn't say enjoyable, but survivable mentally, psychologically, emotionally, and so forth?
And there's a lot of work on things like team building exercises, communication exercises to make sure, like, if there's conflict, what is your conflict resolution protocol, so to speak? You don't want people just being passive aggressive and angry while they're stuck in this confined space, because it's never going to lead to anything good. Also trying to create outlets for people if they need mental help. So there's been folks like the European Space Agency working on therapy robots where people can talk to them, or the Japanese Space Agency was working on a little robotic seal that's so cute, that is kind of like a comfort animal, since you probably won't be able to bring a cat or a dog with you to Mars anytime soon. This was like meant to be a replacement for that. Mm-hmm. A group that I used to lead at ASU called the Five Senses in Space. We were trying to figure out if there were ways to make virtual reality experiences where people could, walk around their hometown or visit a beach or go through the mountains while they're on the way to Mars, or while they're on Mars in case they start to feel homesick. Things like that to try to just sort of mitigate any tension that might come up and help people feel happy and healthy and calm on this journey where they're stuck in a tin can with a handful of other people.
Interesting. So do you is VR being used like on the International Space Station or on missions so far, or anything like that yet?
We use it on Earth sometimes right now. Like there's a setup with a Microsoft HoloLens at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory where you can put it on and kind of look around where the Mars rovers are, because we have so much photographic data that we can just kind of lay it out there. And then you can sort of be like the rover looking around the surface of Mars, which is cool. I can't think of anything where we've used the technology in space yet. I haven't seen anything where the astronauts have used it, but I would say it's probably not that far off, because it's become so widespread now, and the technology is so much more affordable than it was even 2 or 3 years ago.
Wow, that's really lovely. Well, let's see what questions we have. Jen, anything yet that's come in on the channel? Oh, and hello, we have a guest. My dog has decided to join our live stream. This is Anna, everyone, and she's along for for the ride. She just popped into my lap here.
Well, on that segue, I'd be curious, why is it not a good idea to bring cats and dogs up to any of our space missions?
We don't have a lot of experiments on like resources to keep them happy and healthy. We have sent dogs and cats into space kind of in the early days of space exploration when you kind of had the space race between the USSR and the US, trying to figure out who could send what to space more quickly. So the Russians sent a lot of dogs. We sent a monkey at some point. The French sent a cat. So there's been a lot of these animals in space, but a lot of them did not meet good fates returning from space, mostly because we sucked at going to space at that point. We didn't really know what we were doing. Thankfully, we don't do that kind of stuff anymore. So I assume eventually we'll be able to bring things like cats and dogs with us, but right now it's like, oh, it's hard enough for us to figure out like how to have everything we need for humans to survive. So just the resources required to, you know, feed and provide medical care and things like that for pets is probably a little ways off.
I know there are some actors who might not be on this live right now, but might be curious to ask you what kind of training you would suggest to actors doing sci-fi films, you know, learning to be realistic about being on a space mission, or for the First Martian, the actors of the First Martian.
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like maybe reading some books written by astronauts could be really interesting. Chris Hadfield has a book called An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth, and in there he talks a lot about the experience of being in space. He also has a TED Talk where he talks about how going blind in space kind of helped change his perspective on things. That's maybe a little bit of a depressing thing to think like, oh, you could go blind in space, but his eyesight came back. This is that weird effects on your eyeballs in space that we don't quite understand yet. But I find it interesting to like see the stories from astronauts beyond what you tend to just kind of think of like, oh, they're in space to repair a telescope and we see them floating around and like eating M&Ms that are floating in the air or something like that. But actually hearing the stories of like, how did this impact me emotionally? What were the physical effects? Was there any change on how I thought about the Earth or humanity after being up in space? There's this thing called the overview effect that a lot of astronauts describe, where getting that perspective of going into space and then seeing Earth beneath us or beneath them and saying, wow, we're all just on this planet together. There are no borders. Like we're in this, and this tiny thin little blue strip of an atmosphere is the thing that's keeping us all alive. Maybe we should all be working together to do a better job at protecting this thing, because looking everywhere else, it's just utter darkness. It's a very existential experience. William Shatner kind of described it really well in what felt like an existential crisis when he came back from space. Everybody was kind of celebrating with champagne and things like that, and he's standing there next to the space capsule right after he comes out, and he was like, it's just darkness, like beyond us, it's just darkness, like this is what we have, this is everything. And it was kind of amazing to see that reaction from someone who, you know, is not a trained astronaut or anything like that. Like he still had this very profound experience. So yeah, just finding ways to connect to people that have been to space and like reading their human experiences.
You mentioned something about the rover having all these images and possibly, you know, getting that VR experience so you could pretend and experience what it might be to see Mars. Can the public, or how do people get a hold of this VR experience and get to be on Mars?
I can't remember if the VR experience is available online anywhere or not. Maybe if someone is tuned in and they know, they can put the link in the chat, or if I find the link later, I can put it in like the video comments. But the images are all available for free. Anybody can access them. All of the data all of the images from the rovers goes online basically at the same time that the people on the rover team get to see it, which is pretty cool. So if you just Google like Curiosity raw images or Perseverance raw images, the first result on Google should be the just bucket of all the data coming back. And when you click on it, it'll just say like, you know, this image was taken on this day. It'll it'll give you a very small amount of information of like what camera took it, because there's a bunch of cameras on all the missions. But it's kind of fun to go through and just kind of poke at all the pictures that the rovers have been taking. And then there's also kind of like prettier press release photos that NASA will put together, where they'll give you a longer description of like the context of the image and what they were studying and what you're looking at. So you can look through those as well. I think between I think Curiosity at this point has returned like well over 250,000 images alone. Perseverance hasn't been there for quite as long, so it's probably in like the tens of thousands at this point, but it also has more cameras. So there's a lot of pictures you can just sit there and click through. And they're all public domain. All the NASA data is public domain, so people can play with it as they choose.
Wow, that's exciting. Thanks for all those resources. I'm like, I'm going to go check that out.
You can also look up the weather, because both the rovers have weather stations on board. So if you type in Curiosity weather report or Perseverance weather report, it'll bring up a little chart of the last 7 days, or sometimes it's been a little bit since they've gotten data, so the data might be a week or two old. But it'll show you things like what season you're in, the daily high and low temperature. I think there might even be some wind information on there. So that's kind of cool, because one rover's in the northern hemisphere and one is in the southern hemisphere. They're very close to the equator, so they're not that far from each other, but it kind of gives you an idea of like the weather differences at the same time on Mars in 2 different seasons.
Back to you, Dani.
All right. Any other comments or questions in the chat, Jen?
I think that's up to you. I have more questions that I can come up with because I'm such a geek. I've been a fitness trainer, and there's the vibrational training plates that apparently help astronauts recover from their muscle and bone density loss. Is there a possibility of astronauts or people in space using that in space instead of waiting for, body mass loss?
That's a good question. I imagine there's probably some gravitational component in that for the vibration to be effective. But I'm a doctor, but not a medical doctor, so that might be a little bit outside of my area of expertise.
Yeah, I'm just imagining, like, well, if you have to exercise for 2 hours anyway, can we make it more effective so you don't lose the bone density and muscle mass?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like that's something that that would be worth so much investment here on the Earth too, in terms of like, what are different ways you could make exercising more efficient for people in a kind of day-to-day society where it's nearly impossible for anybody to get enough exercise in their day unless you're an actor that's training for a film where your job for a little while is to get super fit. I know for me, even I try really hard to exercise for an hour every day, and it's really difficult. So if we can find ways to, make that easier for people so that everyone is healthier, that would be pretty amazing.
Oh, well, I have a question, Tanya, that we talked about in relation to the script. Talk about anti-gravity devices that often are referenced in sci-fi films and TV shows. Do those things exist?
So we don't have any anti-gravity tech in the sense that you tend to see in sci-fi. Like, they usually invoke some exotic particle, like on Star Trek, they have gravitons, and they'll have like graviton plating to make fake gravity. As far as we know, that doesn't exist, or we just haven't discovered it yet. So to generate artificial gravity in space, usually you end up basically creating something. Well, we haven't done this yet, but what's been proposed is that you would rotate your ship or your space station at a certain speed, so that can generate whatever gravity you want to simulate. So you could have it spinning at moon gravity. Some of the proposals for future Mars missions is that you could have a ship where the gravity kind of ramps down as the mission is going. So you're kind of slowly adjusting to being in Martian gravity, as opposed to just like Earth gravity, microgravity, Mars gravity. I would definitely be worried that if they weren't acclimated on the way to Mars, that maybe they get there and they can't walk. Like, what happens then? That would be pretty bad. So you'd need something like that, or there are groups that are working on these robotic suits, basically exoskeletons, where they have like actuator joints so that you can use them to kind of assist you working in different gravity environments where maybe you need a little bit of help. And they're being developed on Earth to help people like paraplegics so that they can walk again, or other types of disabilities where like having this type of assistance with your joints and mobility would be really helpful. And that would be good for like if you came from a lower gravity environment, like if you were coming from Mars to Earth, maybe you need to be able to acclimate to the higher gravity environment. So if your body isn't really designed, like if you grew up on Mars and your body isn't designed to handle Earth gravity, something like these assistive exoskeletons might be able to either help you transition, or if it's impossible to transition, it could at least make it hopefully so that you would be able to walk around and interact with things on Earth.
Interesting. Wow, it's just really exciting to see how as we're developing technology with living on Mars in mind, how that technology can actually help so many people on Earth, whether it's about fitness, whether it's about mobility, whether it's about different things with diet and so forth. It's really exciting to see. I know there's been concern raised in some circles. It comes up on almost every TV show or film that involves Mars, that there are a lot of resources going toward looking at sustainable life on Mars, and maybe those resources could be used here on Earth instead to make things better for everyone. But it seems like in the duration of that research, a great side effect, so to speak, is that we can actually put some of that tech to use here today on Earth to make people's lives better. What do you think about that?
I totally agree. A lot of the technology that we need to develop to survive on Mars is the same technology we needed to combat climate change on Earth. These carbon dioxide splitters, like the thing we have on Perseverance, they're building that exact same technology. The exact same person actually was inspired by Mars to create these things called artificial trees. And they act as the wind blows through them, kind of like a living tree pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, to generate oxygen. They pull in the CO2 as the wind blows the air through it. The carbon gets sequestered in a little chamber underneath it, and the oxygen goes out just like a plant breathing. And they've started putting these up in certain places on campus at Arizona State University, where this guy, Klaus Lackner, the guy that developed it, where he works. So he works in these artificial trees, and he's on the team for that MOXIE instrument on Mars. A lot of stuff around like developing more sustainable ways of living. We need to do that for Mars. And of course, that's going to have benefits for how we can live better on Earth. Really understanding how we can survive in a resource limited environment. Mars is kind of like the extreme, but there's going to be so many lessons from that we can apply. And so, this comes up all the time. People are like, why are we wasting money on space? But these things have direct benefits. And even if it's something like someone gets inspired by space as a kid, or it's inspired by space like Klaus Lackner to develop a thing that can combat climate change, or like in my own career, I spent 15 years or so working on Mars, and then came to work doing very much Earth direct things at an Earth observing satellite company, working with people trying to understand how climate change is impacting mangroves, how it's impacting ice sheet melt in Antarctica, how it's impacting coral reefs, people that were trying to save walruses in Alaska. Like, it was really cool to be able to make that shift and see, oh, so much of the stuff that I learned on Mars and working on missions at Mars was completely applicable now to these problems on the Earth. And it also gives a lot of people jobs. I mean, NASA employs directly about 20,000 people. And then through their grant programs, funding people at national labs and universities, students that are working, aerospace companies developing technology. There's hundreds of thousands of people supported that way. So it's a really vibrant part of the economy, and a really great way to just inspire people to get excited about space and technology and science. Even if you don't end up working in space, maybe it's something that inspires you to go into science and technology and engineering as a profession when you grow up.
Yeah, I think that is very well said. Well, Jen, any other comments from the chat or anything?
I think we're fine to wrap up. If you have any last questions, Dani. Oh, we
Okay.
should tell
Okay.
people, please look at the website, thefirstmartianfilm.com, and more information about Dr. Tanya Harrison is TANYA Harrison.com. And we have a Seed and Spark crowdfunding campaign. Tell us how our science advisor is working with your film, The First Martian.
Yeah, well, Tanya's been so lovely. Tanya, you read the script and had some really great feedback on certain areas. And then just talking, really helpful for my crew. Oh, what materials are on Mars, textiles and things like that that we might utilize in the future, again, within a kind of zero waste environment. I know we talked about like textiles and mushrooms and bamboo and things. And so that was really helpful for my team. And so we're just grateful to have you basically as part of our crew. We're happy to have you on board.
Oh, thanks so much. I love the chance to get to work on creative things because I think it's so important to merge art and science. It doesn't happen nearly enough. And it's great to see that you wanted to get the science right in the movie for a film that, like, at its core is not necessarily about the science of Mars. So it's really nice, just kind of woven into the story.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Tanya, how can people find you on social media?
You can find me pretty much anywhere as at Tanya of Mars, mostly on Twitter, but I'm starting to pop up more on Instagram. And I just kind of announced that I'm going to start doing stuff on YouTube, hence this lovely little studio here. So if you watch this later and you have questions about Mars that we didn't talk about in this video, definitely send them through my website, and I can either respond to an email or I might make a video answering your question at some point on YouTube in the future.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me and with Jen today. Thank you to Jen, our lovely associate producer, whose voice you've heard with some questions and everything. Thank you all for watching. You can find us on Twitter at First Martian MOV, on Instagram at The First Martian Film, and on Facebook at the First Martian MOV. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed this chat. Hit us up, hit Tanya up if you have any more Mars or space questions, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.
Bye, everyone.